Australian people have voted for change.
It was former Prime Minister Paul Keating who said, when you change the government, you change the country.
But they're back in the building today.
Almost 2 months on from the federal election, and as the new Parliament prepares to meet for the first time tomorrow, the government is still fleshing out just what the first federal transfer of power in almost a decade actually entails.
The economic circumstances we are in are different, and our response needs to be a bit different as well.
There have been the conspicuous things that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and his government have done that take immediate effect since taking office.
Bernard Collaery can finally feel relief.
And then there are the things that we suddenly aren't talking about as much as we did previously. Culture wars, questions of ministerial accountability, and administrative scandals. There are other changes in the conversation too. The argument now is not about a struggle against action on climate change, but about whether we are doing enough to address climate change. It's not just that we are seeing a transition from one side of politics to the other, but also a shift in the subjects under discussion. Many previous presumptions have been blasted away by the passing of a decade, pandemic and disaster. For example, in 2013, Tony Abbott came to office promising to stop the boats, stop the taxes, pay back Labor's debt, crack down on building unions and keep a lid on wages. But a decade on, the whole debt and deficit discussion has been blown out of the water by emergency pandemic spending. Governments around the world are trying to find new ways of dealing with massive government debt, which will take years to repay. And the perceived problem now is that wages are too low, even if inflation has now started to surge around the world.
Well, we need to get wages moving, and you can't turn that around on a dime.
The Albanese government may have been elected with a relatively limited agenda, but it does have a chance to change the conversation, meaning the media also coming to terms with a new way of doing things.
You will not get the call earlier because you yell.
Media coverage since the campaign has sometimes reflected habits of the past, demands for immediate responses to issues that actually require some time. For example, parliamentary negotiations over the proposed 43% emissions reduction target.
Of course it's not a ceiling. I mean, we're hardly going to treat it as a ceiling. As I said, and I've said the same to the crossbenchers, both Greens and Independents. Happy if you've got sensible suggestions which complement our agenda, more than happy to look at those.
Or debates which actually require a bit of nuance, like the new government wanting to talk to interest groups about wages policy at its Jobs Summit in September.
If you're classed as an employer, you get a whole lot of rights. If you fail on that test, all your rights fall off a cliff. And what we need to do is turn that cliff into a ramp so there's a sliding scale that the Fair Work Commission can look at.
Or discussions about how the very levers of economic policy work, like the review of how the Reserve Bank, which has focused its work almost purely on fighting inflation for the last 3 decades, should work in the future.
This is a very different type of inflation challenge. They can't deal with the whole challenge just by jacking up interest rates.
There has also been the occasional tendency to draw long bows of equivalence between the actions of the previous Prime Minister and the new one.
I was fulfilling a responsibility that I believe that I had of travelling to Ukraine. To compare that with a holiday is, I just find, beyond contempt, frankly.
The government has been trying to reframe the economic discussion, and it gets its biggest chance to do this when Treasurer Jim Chalmers delivers an economic statement to Parliament on Thursday.
We are facing together a complex combination of very difficult economic conditions in the near term, as well as a range of longer-term economic challenges as well.
But in the meantime, the new government has already faced an energy crisis, a resurgent pandemic, and alarm about the threat of foot and mouth disease, trying to reset the balance between looking financially responsible and the financial distress of COVID-struck casual workers forced an about-turn on pandemic leave. Now there are questions about the efficacy of mask mandates. While the government is coming to grips with these day-to-day crises and trying to change the national discussion, it seems there is little such flexibility on display from the opposition, despite its crushing election loss, particularly on Labor's emissions reduction target.
Our position is what we took to the election. We're not supporting legislation, and we've been clear about that.
The opposition isn't the only voice in the new parliament, of course. The Greens find themselves with a new relevance, and the crossbench in both the House and the Senate are making themselves heard.
We've been having some really good discussions with Minister BOWEN and his office.
This, at least, is one change in the national conversation.